The accident had left him motionless, his once powerful body lying still in a hospital bed, hooked up to a maze of machines. The doctors and nurses could only offer their expertise, but no one truly knew if he would ever wake up. He was a man who had once ruled a multi-million-dollar empire, his name known across the globe for his sharp business mind and unrelenting ambition. But now all that power and influence meant nothing. It was the fragile reality of life that could change in an instant. A single moment, a twist of fate, and a life was turned upside down. She had never imagined her life would lead her here. At just 23, she was far from the life she had dreamed of. Growing up in a modest household, she had always wanted something more, something bigger. But life had its own plans. She worked long hours in various jobs just to keep things afloat, and when the chance to become a caretaker came along, she had reluctantly accepted. It wasn't the path she had envisioned, but it paid well, and that was what mattered the most. Her job wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful in its own way. Every day she arrived at the hospital to look after a man who, to her, was nothing more than a name in the newspaper. She knew of his success, of course. Who didn't? His company had made him one of the wealthiest men in the world. People admired him, envied him, but to her he was just another patient, another person who needed care, who needed compassion. She couldn't afford to be awestruck by his wealth or his reputation. Her focus had to be on him as a human being. The first time she met him, he was unrecognizable. Gone was the confident man who had always walked with purpose, his head held high, a constant aura of authority surrounding him. Instead, he lay unconscious, his body fragile, his face pale, and his life dependent on machines that beeped and clicked with every passing second. She had to bathe him, feed him, and perform simple tasks that seemed so routine, yet in this case were critical to his recovery. It was an odd feeling for her, caring for someone so much more successful than she was. But she had learned long ago that no matter how rich someone was, when they were lying in a hospital bed, they were just as vulnerable as anyone else. The first few days were quiet. There was nothing much to do but follow the routine. She would enter his room in the morning, check his vital signs, and then carefully wash him. She remembered the first time she bathed him, how strange and uncomfortable it had felt. She was used to taking care of herself, of course, but bathing a grown man, especially one so important, was a different story. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was about dignity, respect, and empathy. She didn't want him to feel less than, even if he couldn't see her or thank her. She did her best to make sure he felt as comfortable as possible. Every time she bathed him, she found herself talking to him. At first it felt silly. After all, he couldn't hear her. But then over time it felt less and less strange. She began to tell him about her life, her dreams, her struggles, and her hopes. It wasn't as though she expected him to respond, but somehow it felt right. She spoke about her family, how much she cared for them, and how she was trying to make a better life for them. She even talked about how she ended up in this job. She explained that it wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was the one she was living, and she was determined to make the best of it. Each day she talked to him. A small part of her believed he could hear her. Even though the doctors had said that he might never wake up, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but she believed that if he could hear her, her words might somehow make a difference. She wasn't a doctor and she didn't know anything about comas, but she believed in the power of connection. She believed that even in his state, the millionaire could feel the sincerity of her voice. On the fourth day of her new routine, she was giving him his bath again, taking extra care with each movement, when something happened that made her stop and look at him in confusion. His hand twitched. Just a slight movement, but enough to make her pause. She blinked, not sure if she had imagined it. His hand lay still, and for a moment she thought she might have been mistaken. She shook her head, trying to push the thought out of her mind. It wasn't possible. The doctors had been clear. He was in a deep coma. There was no way he could move, no way he could hear her. But the moment stuck with her, lingering in her mind long after she left the hospital that evening. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. She went home and tried to forget about it. She knew better than to get her hopes up. The world was full of disappointments, and she wasn't one to set herself up for more heartache. The next morning she returned to the hospital, trying to push aside the thought of his hand twitching. But as soon as she stepped into his room, she felt a strange energy in the air. She couldn't explain it, but something was different. She checked his vitals as usual, but this time she noticed that his breathing was steadier, smoother. The machines around him hummed in a way that was different from the usual rhythm. She paused for a moment, unsure of what she was sensing. Could it be? Was he getting better? She went about her routine, washing him gently, but her mind raced. She couldn't deny it. There was a change, something she couldn't explain. As she finished, she sat by his side, talking to him again, telling him about her day, about the things that had happened since the last time they spoke. And then, just as she was about to leave the room, something extraordinary happened. His fingers twitched again. This time, she didn't doubt it. She called for the nurse, her voice trembling with excitement. The nurse rushed in, and the two of them checked his vitals again, unsure of what to make of the situation. And then, in the most miraculous moment, his eyes fluttered open. At first, it was only for a brief moment, just a flicker of movement. But to her, it was everything. He was awake. For the first time in months, the millionaire was awake. The nurse stared in disbelief, and the young caretaker's heart raced in her chest. She could hardly believe what was happening. She called for the doctors to come immediately. The millionaire's breathing deepened, and his eyes slowly focused on her face. He looked confused, disoriented, as if he wasn't sure where he was or how he got there. But when his gaze landed on her, there was something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. For the first time in what felt like forever, she realized that he was truly alive. And with his awakening, everything changed. The millionaire's eyes remained open for a few moments, but the confusion on his face was undeniable. He blinked slowly, as if trying to understand where he was, what had happened to him. His gaze moved from the young caretaker to the machines around him, then back to her. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. His steady breath, the flicker of life returning in his eyes, it all felt like a dream. She had spent so many days looking at his unresponsive body, wondering if he would ever wake up. And now here he was, alive and looking at her with a blank stare, as if trying to make sense of everything. Her heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't expected this, not really. Despite the small movements she'd seen the day before, nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke to him. "You're awake," she said softly, almost to herself. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she had to speak. It felt like the right thing to do. The millionaire's lips parted, but no sound came out. He attempted to speak again, but his voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. "Where am I?" His words were slow, uncertain. She rushed to his side, her voice reassuring as she replied, "You're in the hospital. You've been in a coma for a while now. It's okay. You're safe." She couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. She had spent so many days speaking to him, imagining this moment, and now that it was here, it felt surreal. The room was quiet except for the sound of his labored breathing and the beeping of the machines that monitored his condition. The nurse had arrived by this time, and she quickly took over the medical checks, making sure that everything was stable. But the young caretaker could hardly focus on anything but the millionaire's sudden return to life. He had been unconscious for so long, and now here he was, slowly becoming aware of his surroundings. The doctors soon arrived, and the room became filled with activity. The young caretaker stood quietly by, watching as they checked his vitals, examined the machines, and discussed what had happened. They were just as surprised as she was. There was no explanation for why he had suddenly woken up, no reason for the miracle that had just occurred. All they could do was monitor him and make sure that he was stable. Hours passed, and the millionaire's condition seemed to improve, though slowly. He was still weak, his body fragile from the long period of being in a coma. The doctors told him it would take time to regain his strength, and they would need to observe him carefully. But the fact that he was awake at all was something of a miracle. The young caretaker was still in shock, her mind racing with questions. Why had he woken up? What did this mean for him? And more importantly, what did this mean for her? She had spent so many hours by his side, caring for him, talking to him, and now he was awake. He wasn't just another patient anymore. He was a real person with a story, with a life to live, just like her. As the day went on, the millionaire's awareness of his surroundings began to improve. He started asking more questions, trying to piece together what had happened to him. His memory was foggy at first, and he couldn't remember the accident that had put him in a coma. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious or even what had led to this moment. All he knew was that he had been in a dark place and now somehow he was here, in this room with people watching over him. The young caretaker stayed by his side for as long as she could. She watched as the doctors worked, trying to make sense of his recovery, but most of her attention was on him. She couldn't stop herself from thinking about how different things were now. He was no longer just a patient to her. He was someone who was alive, someone who had a second chance at life. And it was because of her care, her kindness, that he had made it through this far. At one point, he looked at her with a kind of gratitude in his eyes that she hadn't expected. "Thank you," he said, his voice still weak but clear. "I don't know what happened, but I feel like you've been here with me the whole time." His words were simple, but they meant everything to her. She hadn't expected him to say anything like that. She had only been doing her job, caring for him, because that's what she was hired to do. But hearing him say those words made her feel something deep inside, something she couldn't quite explain. "You're welcome," she replied softly, not knowing what else to say. She was still in shock, still processing everything that had happened. But there was something in the way he looked at her that made her believe he was truly grateful for the care she had given him. Maybe he hadn't been aware of her presence in those long months, but now that he was awake, he seemed to recognize the role she had played in his recovery. As the days passed, the millionaire's condition continued to improve. He was no longer in critical condition, and his memory began to return in bits and pieces. But even though he was getting better, he was still far from being his old self. He had to relearn how to do basic things, how to walk, how to talk more clearly, how to regain the strength he had lost during his time in the coma. During this time, the young caretaker continued to help him. She wasn't just there to bathe him anymore. Now she helped him with physical therapy, assisted him with walking, and even spent time talking to him about his life. She had no idea what his future would look like, but she couldn't help but feel that somehow they were both on the verge of something new. She could see that the millionaire was starting to feel more like himself. His sharp mind was slowly coming back, and with it his ambition and drive. But there was something different about him now. He wasn't as ruthless as he had been before. There was a kindness in his eyes, a softness in his manner that hadn't been there when she first started taking care of him. Perhaps it was the time spent in a coma, or maybe it was the way she had cared for him without expecting anything in return. But he seemed changed. One afternoon, as she helped him with his exercises, he turned to her and said, "I don't know how to thank you. You've done more for me than anyone else could. When I woke up, I was confused, but you were there and you made me feel like I wasn't alone. You saved me." Her heart skipped a beat. She had never expected him to say something like that. She wasn't looking for recognition, but hearing him say those words made her feel like everything she had done for him had been worth it. It wasn't about the money, the fame, or the attention. It was about making a difference in someone's life, about showing kindness when it was needed most. As she stood there, watching him struggle to stand on his own for the first time in months, she felt a surge of pride. He was doing it. He was coming back to life, and she had been a part of that. It wasn't just a job for her anymore. It was something deeper, something that connected them in ways she couldn't explain. The millionaire was slowly but surely reclaiming his life. But the question now was, what kind of life would he choose to live? The person who had gone into that coma was no longer the same, and neither was she. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, the millionaire grew stronger. The room that had once felt so cold and sterile was now filled with his quiet determination and the sound of his efforts to regain control of his body. The young caretaker was there every step of the way, assisting him with his therapy, encouraging him when the task seemed too hard, and providing the unwavering support that he had come to rely on. It wasn't just the physical healing that was taking place. Something deeper was happening as well. When he first woke up, his mind had been foggy, like a heavy mist that obscured everything around him. But slowly he started to remember more, flashes of moments from his life before the accident, the people he knew, the decisions he had made. His world was beginning to take shape again, but it was a different world now. He wasn't sure what had caused the shift in him, but he could feel it. It wasn't just his body that had been broken in the accident, it was his perspective on life itself. Everything had changed, and he wasn't sure what to make of it yet. The young caretaker had become more than just someone who cared for him. She had become a quiet anchor in his world, someone who made him feel human again. who reminded him that life still had meaning, even in its most vulnerable moments. She had listened to him, cared for him, and even shared parts of her own life with him, creating a connection he had never anticipated. He had spent his life surrounded by people who saw him only for his wealth and status. But here was someone who saw him as a person who needed help, who needed understanding, who needed someone to care for him not because of what he had, but because of who he was. It was strange for him to be cared for in such a way, but it felt right. She treated him with dignity, as though he were just another person, and perhaps that was what made it so powerful. No one had ever truly done that for him before. In the midst of his recovery, he began to reflect on his life, the life he had built, the choices he had made, and the relationships that had been formed around his wealth and success. He realized how much he had lost, not just in terms of material things, but in terms of genuine connections. In his pursuit of more money, more power, more influence, he had lost sight of what truly mattered: human connection, love, and compassion. The young caretaker, despite her own struggles and challenges, had shown him the kind of love he had never known. It wasn't flashy or grandiose. It wasn't about making him feel special or powerful. It was about making him feel seen, heard, and cared for in his most vulnerable state. It was something he had never fully understood until now. As his recovery continued, their conversations deepened. She began to tell him more about her life, about her family, her dreams, and the sacrifices she had made to get to where she was. She didn't have the wealth or luxury he had known, but she had something far more valuable: a heart full of love for those she cared about. Her story wasn't one of fame or fortune, but of perseverance and hope. She shared her struggles, how she had always worked hard but never quite seemed to catch a break, and how she had ended up in this job, taking care of someone who was a stranger to her. She had no idea that this simple act of kindness would turn into something so transformative. He listened intently, fascinated by her resilience. She was nothing like the people he had known before. She didn't want anything from him, and that was what made her so different. She wasn't trying to impress him or gain something from their connection. She simply cared for him because that was who she was. It was humbling for him, and in a strange way, it made him realize how little he had truly understood about the world before. One afternoon, as he was sitting up in bed trying to regain his strength, he turned to her with a question that had been on his mind for days. "Why do you do it?" he asked, his voice steady but curious. "Why did you take this job knowing how hard it would be? You could have chosen anything else, anything easier." She paused, looking at him for a moment before answering. "Because someone has to," she said simply. "I needed to take care of my family, and this was the best way to do it. It wasn't easy, but sometimes you have to make sacrifices to get by. I didn't expect to be taking care of someone like you, but I'm glad I did." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about her words. "You're a strong person," he said softly. "Most people wouldn't have been able to do what you've done. You didn't just take care of me, you brought me back to life in a way, and I don't know how to thank you for that." Her eyes softened and she smiled gently. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes we help people not because we have to, but because it's the only thing that makes sense." He was struck by the simplicity of her answer. It wasn't about grand gestures or fancy rewards. It was about doing what was right even when it wasn't easy. In a world where everything seemed to be about taking and getting, she had shown him that there was still something pure about giving, about caring for someone without expecting anything in return. It was a lesson he hadn't known he needed, but now, in the quiet of his recovery, it felt like the most important lesson he had ever learned. Days turned into weeks, and as his strength returned, so did his resolve. He began to see his life through new eyes that had been clouded by years of ambition and selfishness. He started to understand that there was more to life than just success, than just building an empire. There was a deeper sense of purpose in helping others, in being there for those who needed you, in forming connections that were based on something more than money or status. But with this realization came another truth. He wanted to help her. He wanted to give back, to do something for her, to show her that her kindness hadn't gone unnoticed. He had spent so much of his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. But here was someone who had given him something priceless, without asking for anything in return. It wasn't just about money. It was about finding a way to make a real difference in her life, to show her that she mattered. One evening, as the sun set behind the hospital windows, he made a decision. He asked the young caretaker to sit down with him, and with a seriousness in his voice he spoke. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he began. "You've given me something I never thought I could have again, hope. And I want to help you in whatever way I can. Your family, your future. I want to be there for you." She looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You don't have to do that," she said, almost in disbelief. "I've been doing this because it's my job, not because I wanted anything from you." "I know," he said, his tone gentle. "But I don't think I can walk away from this without doing something for you. I want to help you, whether it's paying off your debts, sending you to school, or just making sure that you and your family are taken care of. You've shown me more kindness than anyone else ever has, and I want to make sure you know that you matter." The young caretaker was overwhelmed by his words. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever offered her something like that before, and the weight of it was hard to process. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I never expected this." "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "Just know that I mean it. You deserve more than what you've had, and I want to make sure you get it." As he spoke, she realized that their connection had become something far more than just patient and caregiver. It had become a bond that was rooted in genuine care, in kindness, and in the recognition of each other's humanity. Neither of them could have anticipated this when their journey together began, but here they were, both transformed by their time together. The days following their conversation were filled with change. For the first time in what felt like forever, the millionaire began to see the world with a clarity that had been clouded by his past ambitions. He spent his time reflecting on his life, not just on his recovery, but on everything that had brought him to this moment. He had always been a man of action, someone who made decisions quickly, who moved from one goal to the next without ever really stopping to think about the bigger picture. But now, in the quiet moments of his recovery, he realized that he had never truly stopped to consider what really mattered. His time spent in a coma had given him a unique perspective. For months he had been unconscious, unable to interact with the world. He had no control over what happened to him, no way of knowing what others were doing or saying. In that silence, he had come to understand something important, that life was fragile. All of his wealth, all of his power had meant nothing when he was lying in that hospital bed. It was the simple things, the things that could so easily be taken for granted, that truly mattered. He realized that the young caretaker, who had cared for him with such tenderness, had shown him more about life than anyone ever had. Her kindness, her willingness to care for him without asking for anything in return. It had touched him in ways he couldn't quite explain. She had become more than just someone who looked after him. She had become a symbol of everything he had lost and everything he could still gain. The young caretaker, on the other hand, had begun to see the millionaire in a new light. When she first started caring for him, he had been nothing more than a job, a paycheck, and a figurehead of success. But now, as he slowly regained his strength, she saw the man behind the power. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was someone who had experienced loss, who had faced adversity, and who was trying to find his way back. She saw the vulnerability in him, the confusion that came with realizing that everything he had once thought was important might not be the same anymore. It wasn't just his physical healing that mattered. It was his emotional and mental recovery, too. He had to learn how to live again, how to find purpose in a world that no longer seemed to make sense to him. And in a way, the young caretaker was helping him do that. She didn't know it, but her presence had become a lifeline for him. She gave him hope, not by offering him grand solutions or promises, but by simply being there. Her quiet strength, her unwavering support made all the difference in the world. As the weeks went on, the millionaire became more determined to make changes in his life. He began to reassess his business dealings, his relationships, and his priorities. He had spent so much of his life focused on accumulating wealth and success, but now he realized that those things had come at a cost. He had neglected the people who truly mattered, the relationships that should have been his foundation. The young caretaker had shown him what it meant to truly care for someone, to put others before yourself, and he couldn't ignore that lesson. One afternoon, as the young caretaker helped him with his physical therapy, he asked her a question that had been on his mind for days. "What do you want, really?" he asked, his voice steady but curious. "I mean, you've done so much for me, but what do you want out of life? What's your dream?" She looked at him, a little surprised by the question. She hadn't expected him to ask her about her dreams, about her life outside of the hospital room. She paused for a moment, trying to find the right words. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've spent so much time just trying to get by, trying to take care of my family, that I haven't really thought much about what I want for myself. But I guess deep down I've always wanted something more. I've always wanted to have the freedom to do what I love, to help people, to make a real difference in the world." He listened intently, his gaze thoughtful. "You deserve that," he said quietly. "You've given so much of yourself to others. You deserve to have something for yourself. I want to help you achieve that. Whatever it is you need, whatever it takes, I want to make sure you get there." She was stunned by his words. She had never imagined that someone like him would care enough to ask, let alone offer to help her achieve her dreams. She had always been focused on survival, on getting through each day, on taking care of her family. But the idea that she could have something more, that she could have a future where she could pursue her passions, was something she had never allowed herself to fully imagine. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't want you to think that I'm asking for anything. I've always done what I had to do, and that's enough for me." He shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It's not about what you're asking for. It's about what you deserve. You've shown me something that I didn't understand before. You've taught me that there's more to life than just power and wealth. You've shown me the value of kindness, of being there for someone when they need it the most. And I want to give that back to you. I want you to have the life you deserve." She didn't know what to say. It wasn't just the words that caught her off guard. It was the sincerity behind them. He wasn't offering her money or material things. He was offering her something far more valuable. The chance to live the life she had always dreamed of. A life where she could be true to herself, where she could follow her passions and make a real impact. Over the next few weeks, their relationship continued to evolve. They spent more time talking about their hopes, their dreams, and the paths they wanted to take. The millionaire, now more aware than ever of the importance of human connection, started to open up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone before. He shared his regrets, his fears, and his hopes for the future, and as they talked, the young caretaker began to see the man he had become, the man who had learned to value life not for what it could give him, but for what he could give others. As his recovery progressed, the millionaire began to make plans for the future. He knew he wanted to step back from the cutthroat world of business and focus on something more meaningful. He wanted to give back, to help those who were struggling, to support causes that mattered, and to make a real difference in the world. He had seen firsthand how fragile life could be, and he didn't want to waste any more time chasing things that didn't matter. He began to work on a plan to create a foundation, one that would help those in need, particularly those who were going through difficult times just as he had. It was something he had never considered before, but now it felt like the only thing that truly mattered. He wanted to help others the way the young caretaker had helped him. He wanted to create something that would have a lasting impact, something that would outlive him and make the world a better place. The young caretaker, too, started to think more about her future. She had always put others first, but now she realized that it was time to think about herself. She didn't know exactly what her path would look like, but she knew that it would be different. She would no longer just be a caretaker, a role that had defined her for so long. She would take the opportunities that were now in front of her, and she would chase the dreams she had put on hold for so long. As their paths continued to intertwine, both the millionaire and the young caretaker began to see the world with new eyes. They had both learned invaluable lessons from each other, lessons about kindness, about perseverance, and about the importance of caring for others. And as they faced the future together, they knew that whatever came next, they would be ready for it, no longer defined by their pasts, but by the hope and the possibilities of the future. The transformation in both of them was undeniable. The millionaire, once driven solely by ambition and success, had found a new purpose in life. His focus was no longer on accumulating wealth or expanding his empire. Instead, he had begun to look outward at the world around him, and at the people who needed help. He had learned, through his time in the hospital and through the kindness of the young caretaker, that true success wasn't measured in dollars or deals. It was measured in the lives you touched, the people you helped, and the positive impact you left behind. For the young caretaker, life had also changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had spent so long focusing on survival, on taking care of her family, that she had never really thought about what she wanted for herself. But now, with the millionaire's offer of help, she began to realize that there were opportunities out there for her too. She didn't have to just get by, she could thrive. She could pursue her dreams, and for the first time she felt a sense of hope that she had long since forgotten. They both knew that their lives were no longer the same. Their bond, formed in the quiet moments of recovery and care, had become something deep, something that neither of them had expected. What started as a professional relationship, caregiver and patient, had blossomed into something far more meaningful. They had shared their hopes, their fears, and their dreams. They had opened up to each other in ways they never had before, and through this, they had found a connection that neither wealth nor status could ever provide. One afternoon, as they sat together in the hospital garden, the millionaire turned to the young caretaker. He had been thinking about the future a lot lately, and he knew that he had to act on the feelings that had been growing in him since his recovery. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," he said, his voice calm but firm, "and I want to make sure that you have every opportunity to achieve your dreams. I know I've offered to help, but I don't want you to feel like you have to accept anything out of obligation. I want to help because I believe in you." The young caretaker looked at him, a mix of surprise and gratitude in her eyes. "I never expected any of this," she replied quietly. "I've always just tried to get by, but now I see that maybe I don't have to settle for just getting by. Maybe I can actually go after what I want." The millionaire smiled, his expression sincere. "You've already done more for me than I could ever repay. You gave me something I didn't even realize I needed, a sense of hope. And for that, I'll always be grateful. But I want you to know that whatever you choose, I'm here to support you. Whether you want to go back to school, start a business, or just take some time for yourself, I want to help you make that happen." She felt a lump form in her throat. She had never imagined that anyone would care enough to help her like this, to truly want to see her succeed. She had always been the one giving, the one taking care of others, but now she realized that it was okay to accept help, to allow someone else to give back. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. "I've never really had the chance to think about what I want. But I know that I want to do something that matters, something that can make a difference." "You've already made a difference," the millionaire said softly, "and now it's your time to shine. Whatever path you choose, I know you'll do great things." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, and for the first time in a long time, both of them felt at peace. The young caretaker had come a long way since the days when she had first walked into the millionaire's hospital room. She had come to realize that there was more to life than just surviving. And now, with the help of the millionaire, she could finally begin to build a life for herself. For the millionaire, the past few months had been a revelation. He had spent so much time focusing on his business, on building his empire, that he had forgotten the importance of human connection. He had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him, people who only valued him for his wealth. But the young caretaker had shown him something different. She had shown him that true value was found in kindness, in generosity, and in the relationships we build with others. He no longer wanted to be known for his wealth or success. He wanted to be known for the impact he had on people's lives. As the days passed, the young caretaker began to take steps toward the future she had always dreamed of. With the millionaire's help, she enrolled in a local college to pursue a degree in social work, hoping to one day help others the way she had helped him. It wasn't an easy journey. There were still challenges to face, and she knew that the road ahead wouldn't be without its obstacles. But she was no longer afraid. She had found the strength to take control of her own destiny, and for the first time she felt like her life was truly hers to shape. The millionaire, too, began to focus on his new mission. He started his foundation, just as he had promised, and began working on initiatives that would provide support to those who were going through difficult times. He was no longer interested in the cutthroat world of business. He wanted to make a difference in the world, and he knew that this was the way to do it. One day, a few months later, they met again, this time in the millionaire's office. The young caretaker, now a student with a renewed sense of purpose, sat across from him, her eyes bright with excitement. She had come a long way, and the changes in her were evident. She no longer looked like someone who was just getting by. She looked like someone who was living her dream. "I can't believe how much has changed," she said, her voice filled with awe. I never thought I would be here in this place with all of this opportunity. The millionaire smiled warmly. I always knew you had it in you. You just needed to believe in yourself. She smiled back, feeling a sense of pride that she had never known before. I'm still a long way from where I want to be, but I know that I'm on the right path. And that's because of you. It's because of you, he replied. You showed me that life is about more than just what you have, it's about what you give. And I'm proud of you for taking that lesson and using it to change your life. They sat in silence for a moment, both reflecting on how far they had come. Neither of them could have predicted that this journey would lead them here, to this moment of mutual respect, admiration, and hope. What had begun as a simple job for the young caretaker and a moment of vulnerability for the millionaire had turned into something life-changing for both of them. They had both learned that no matter how much wealth or success you have, it's the relationships you build, the lives you touch, and the kindness you show that truly define you. As they parted ways that day, there was a sense of fulfillment in the air, a sense that they had both found something far more valuable than anything money could buy. They had found meaning, purpose, and most importantly, each other's friendship. Their lives were no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had gained, a new understanding of what it meant to truly live.